25 times, did you know that? Americans are 25 times more likely to die from gun violence than people in other developed countries. It's a shocking statistic, and it's something that Moses Seenarine really digs into in his book Liberal Losers. It's not just another book about gun control, though. Seenarine's background is really interesting. He's a son of immigrants. His family actually escaped indentured servitude, and he was a first-generation college grad. So he really brings his unique perspective to the issue. And in chapter 16, he really gets into the heart of the conservative arguments surrounding guns. See, for a lot of conservatives, it goes beyond just the Second Amendment, right? It's about this deep-seated belief in self-reliance, this distrust of the government getting involved in their lives. It's about this idea that owning a gun is like intertwined with freedom, with protecting yourself.
Yeah, and that idea of protection is really key here because when you think back on like the historical context surrounding the Second Amendment, it wasn't just about some theoretical tyrannical government. It was about the realities of what early America was dealing with, right? Conflicts with Native Americans, the need to maintain control over enslaved people. It's not a comfortable part of our history, but it definitely adds another layer to how we understand the Second Amendment today.
Absolutely. And Seenarine, he doesn't shy away from those uncomfortable truths at all. He points out that for a lot of people on the right, when they argue against gun control, it boils down to a few key points. They say it infringes on their personal freedom, that it's a slippery slope towards too much government control, and that ultimately it just won't work. Criminals, they're going to get their hands on guns regardless. Of course, there are always nuances, even within conservative viewpoints. Seenarine acknowledges that. Most conservatives, they accept certain limitations like background checks, waiting periods. He uses the example of the Brady Act. But if you try to go beyond that, you kind of hit a wall.
And that wall is built on a couple of major Supreme Court decisions, Heller in 2008 and McDonald a couple of years later. Heller really solidified that individual right to own a gun, even striking down, you remember, that D.C. handgun ban. And then McDonald came along and said, okay, that individual right applies to states too, not just federal law. And these two cases, they really shifted things, made it so much harder to pass any kind of stricter gun control.
It's like the whole playing field tilted, and we've seen this wave of efforts to actually expand gun rights even more. Seenarine talks about stand your ground laws, and you can't help but think about Trayvon Martin and the conversation that's sparked. And then there's the whole push for campus carry, arming teachers. These are ideas that really get people fired up,
And it's fascinating, because it all ties back to this bigger picture that Seenarine explores in chapter 17. He critiques the broken windows style of policing, which is basically cracking down on even small crimes to try and prevent more serious ones. And that idea, just like this push for more guns, it really zeroes in on individual responsibility, but it doesn't really address those complex social issues that are feeding into all of this,
It makes you think, though, right? Like all those arguments, they might make sense on some level, but how can you ignore just how bad gun violence is in America? Seenarine, he lays it out there. He reminds us that guns, they're the leading cause of death for kids and teenagers in this country, which is just, it's hard to even process that. And then there's the financial side. Gun violence costs the U.S. like, what was it, $557 billion every year? And even that number, it can't really capture the human cost, the fear, the trauma. I mean, just this year, the Surgeon General actually declared gun violence a national public health crisis. So it's not just a political issue anymore. It's a threat to all of us.
And what's interesting is how this connects to what Seenarine was saying about privatization in this same chapter. He's really critical of how, the desire to make money often overshadows people's well-being. You could almost say it's similar to the gun debate. Is there a point where the gun industry, because it's so big, it makes so much money, that it becomes even harder to talk about, actually doing something about it? It makes you wonder.
For sure. And it gives even more weight to those counter-arguments that Seenarine talks about. Like he's saying we can't just talk about rights here. Public safety has to be part of the conversation too. Your right to own a gun, it can't be absolute. Not when it comes at such a high cost to everyone else. And he's got the data to back it up, too. Like he points out that stricter gun control can work. It's not just some pipe dream. He uses the examples of Australia and the UK. They both got a lot tougher on gun control, and their gun violence rates, they went way down. So it's hard to just brush that off.
And then there's that whole other side of it, that gun culture that Seenarine digs into, particularly how guns and masculinity get all tied up together. It makes you think about his own life, his family escaping indentured servitude. It highlights how much our experiences, our surroundings really impact these issues. It's so much bigger than just, oh, this person's a good guy with a gun, that person's a bad guy. There are these deeper forces at work that we can't ignore.
And, this is where things get really interesting. Because Seenarine, He connects gun violence to race in a way that a lot of people they don't want to go there. He's not afraid to talk about, like, the uncomfortable stuff, like how Black and brown Americans are so much more likely to be shot by police, how they're incarcerated at way higher rates. And it makes you realize that the Second Amendment, it doesn't exist in this bubble, right? It plays out so differently depending on who you are, where you come from.
Right, and that's something you see throughout Senarine's writing. It's like he's always pushing us to look beyond those surface-level arguments and really grapple with the systemic issues that are driving all this. We can't just talk about individual rights without acknowledging, all the historical baggage, the social context. It's just not that simple.
It makes you think twice about that whole argument that gun violence is like just a mental health issue, that it's just a few bad apples with mental illness who are causing all the problems. Because Senarine, he really challenges that idea. He's not saying mental health isn't a factor, but he says it's often used as a way to avoid talking about the bigger picture.
Right.
We're talking about things like poverty, like lack of opportunity, like, yes, systemic racism. Those things matter too.
Exactly. He's saying these shootings, these tragedies, they're not just random events, they're a symptom of these deeper problems in our society. And until we start addressing those root causes, we're going to keep having the same arguments over and over again, and nothing will really change.
He ends the chapter with this question that's really stuck with me, and I think it's something we all need to ask ourselves. How many shootings is too many? What's it going to take for us to finally say enough and actually do something to make a real difference? And that's a wrap on our deep dive into Moses Sanarine's Liberal Losers, specifically how this book helps us understand the complexities of the gun control debate right here in America. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll see you next time.